Hi, I'm Metta Spencer. I'm in Toronto and I have friends in Syracuse, New York. One of my friends is Louis Kriesberg, who is a professor at Syracuse University, or he's been retired a while. In the 80s, created an organization called the Program on the Analysis and Resolution of Conflict, or PARC. Bruce Dayton. He's worked on environmental conflicts and identity, and has been teaching for a number of years now at the School for International Training in Brattleboro, Vermont. Together, you have produced a number of different editions, I believe, of a book, which, Lou, will you hold up your book? It's called Constructive Conflicts, From Escalation to Resolution. If I came to you and said, I want to start a social movement, how would I go about it? And what would you advise me to do?
We often get involved when things have really gotten very bad, and it's much harder to dig out from that. But there are ways for that too. Working with some intermediaries, working with back channels, working with new partners who have a stake in what's going on. So think about a range and discuss them with other people who share your interests and goals. There are alternatives to the messes that we create.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Bruce, do you want to elaborate on that?
Sure. I'll give an unsatisfying answer because people get frustrated with academics because they always say, well, it depends, but it does depend, right? If somebody comes to me with that question, what should we do? The first answer is always, you have to do good analysis. And what I find with activists and people who are launching into conflict management interventions, there's not a lot of upfront analysis. So in some ways, I think what I do as a professor, what Lou has done with his training, is where in some ways helping people become doctors of conflict, because there's underlying causes of conflict that you have to uncover. Some of them are social psychological, some are structural inequality, others are emotional wounds. There's surface interests that separate people. So that's one thing to decipher. There's multiple stakeholders. Conflicts are always complicated. It's usually not just a binary one group against another. There's other stakeholders. You have to be able to analyze and map them. There's dividers and connectors that separate or bring together all parties, whether they're adversaries or not. You have to figure out what those are. There's imbalances in power. You need to figure out what those are. So I guess what I'm getting at is you can't do conflict resolution or conflict transformation without doing the analysis. And conflicts have a lot of similar roots, but they're also all have certain things enough in common that common diagnostic tools help us to figure out where to start and why we might start in this place instead of another. If you just take the issue of power, for example, there's an easy one to look at. If your adversary has much more power than you do, it's very unlikely that they are going to change willingly. After all, the old truism of negotiation is people don't negotiate as long as they think they can achieve all the things they want unilaterally. In that kind of situation of great power asymmetries, maybe some kind of mobilization or social movement that increases the cost to the more powerful party of not negotiating is the first thing you will need to do. On the other hand, if power relations are fairly equal and you've reached a moment where people are realizing that the old way of doing things aren't working, maybe dialogue is possible. And so here we have two fundamentally different ways of going after achieving change. One that's assertion and what people call peace pushing, and the other that's based on dialogue and understanding, a more persuasive engaged way of doing conflict.
And I think there's kind of an incompatibility between those, and maybe even a difference of talents. I get mad. I'm not a very good mediator, for example, because I tend to take sides.
There's transformations that keep going on. Conflicts are dynamic. They start one way, they go on one route or another. They backslide into something else. They try something else as they interact with each other. And other parties come in. Some parties leave. There are shifts in the leadership. So it's very fluid.
It's sort of unidirectional. That is, if you start off soft, isn't the tendency to escalate and become harder? Having once become, for example, violent, it seems to me it's rare for them to go back to just involve dialogue.
No, the violence doesn't continue forever. No conflict goes on. They all come to some change. And sometimes, just pointing something out. I think the women's movement is the most transformational movement in American history. Because it's a cultural change of great magnitude. And it came about with a lot of different things going on in different localities at different levels. It isn't one thing. We have a local chapter here that I used to participate in of now. We had a former
give me some examples of conflicts that you've actually been involved in trying to work with. A lot of the real conflicts, civil resistance movements in the world are not as successful as some of them a few years ago. And the evidence for this, I think, comes from the work of Erica Chenoweth and Maria Stephan, because they had a book several years ago about why civil resistance works. And they showed that civil that is to say, nonviolent resistance is far more successful than violent movements. We could even talk about numbers. They did a historical analysis with, really mathematically correct procedures. Nowadays, that's no longer the case. It's been reversed. So that the frequency of success among civil resistance movements in the world in doing things like changing their regime of the country that they're in, it's not working as well. And that's, to me, very troubling. And I think we need to talk about why that's the case.
I wonder if part of it is it was almost fashionable for a while to have the orange revolutions of this color. The nonviolent thing seemed to be just going from wonderful to wonderful.
Mm-hmm.
And people maybe tried to do something that they were ill prepared to do.
Mm-hmm.
They thought it was easy. You just go out in the street and everybody goes out in the street and boom, the dictator goes away and you have victory and dance in the streets. It never could be that way. I think from the little I know about the Arab Spring, and it was the Tunisian and Egyptian youth had, for a couple of years, had been reading the writings of Gene Sharp and getting some idea and talking for a while about what they could do. They also stuck to it. more readily, more steadily than in some of the other Arab countries where they shifted to violence fairly quickly because the government was so repressive. I think that may be some of what's involved. That there wasn't the kind of preparation, and it may be that the governments were a little tougher, and I don't know, and the external intervention was different.
I think it's also, I mean, part of the question is they may be working less effectively, but the revolutionary insight from that research was that they work more effectively than violence. I don't know of any data that suddenly shows that violent movements are more successful than nonviolent movements. I think the data may show a decline in success of nonviolent movements. I would speculate that successful nonviolent movements require incredible in-group cohesion. It often requires a charismatic leader, discipline, a vision. I also wonder the power of social movements and the more sophisticated that governments are at harnessing information and undercutting the cohesion of movements by spreading false information and disrupting allies from joining and disrupting trust among movement members. I don't know. I mean, I think it's an incredibly complex question to understand why, but I think looking at just the whole information technology revolution and these false narratives that have really become part of the battle of every conflict now. Truth is contested everywhere, and we trust hardly anybody to tell us the truth, even our leaders of movements.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's true. And I know that Erica Chenoweth is looking again at the causes for this change. And I think one of the messages is that the dictators have caught on to what the protesters are up to and have figured out ways around it to contain it, as, for example, China is now with respect to Hong Kong. I think the Hong Kong people have basically lost. But maybe it's not all over yet. But the other thing is that two things. One is what Lou just pointed out, that there wasn't enough preparation. But I think the problem in the preparation was not just in holding the mass movement, but what you're going to do the day after you win. Once the guys give you the keys to the palace, now you're in charge of the government and you have no idea what your policies are. You haven't planned a regime, that you know how to bring anything into effect. So unless you actually do sort of a government in exile preparation before holding your nonviolent struggle, it seems to me to be risky. And another thing I've heard is that the very fact that we now have social media, our cell phones make it easy to contact each other, and it becomes very easy to organize a demonstration of some kind. You can get people out very, very fast. But that is not such a good method of building an organization that's going to be able to, they know each other, they know they have a plan, et cetera. You need a much different medium of communication than your cell phone in order to set up a government or some other institution that is going to be required after you succeed. So those are part of the reasons. I'm not sure how much of the change can be attributed to that. But let's consider some of the more recent movements, global movements. I mean, just in the last few months, we've been seeing the Black Lives Matter movements in the U.S., which I think have had rather good success.
Again, it seems about the timing. It's partly that for the last couple of decades, whites have become more tolerant, less prejudiced. The public opinion polls indicate that shift was occurring. African Americans were getting more resources. They were in politics in a way that hadn't been before. They had reasons to think that things could be better and they could make it better. And all that, I think, collided into this explosion of change. And suddenly the southern states are taking down the Confederate flag and I don't know, things that had been talked about for a while.
Statues of Robert E. Lee.
Yeah, but I wanted to mention the
hold it up higher. We are. I can't see it all.
Indivisible.
Indivisible. Oh yes.
I think that's a very important phenomena that's going on in every congressional district. There are local groups building pressure at the local level. There are a couple of staffers who organized this at the beginning are kind of using the Tea Party tactics and strategy. We have one in this district, which I don't know, Bruce, if you've been involved, but I've been peripherally involved in the activity. We get marching orders every Monday as to what phone calls, who to talk to, what to do, where there may be a little protest, and very substantive issues are discussed. Training is given, and that's going on all across this country.
Joe Cirincione was in Ottawa at a conference that I participated in about a year ago now, and he was very enthusiastic about the Indivisible movement. I hadn't even heard about it at the time, and he also mentioned that what their model was the Tea Party, that they had taken a lesson from the success of the Tea Party movement. I don't know anything about the Tea Party movement. How did it work? What was special? And what did they learn? What did the Indivisible people learn from the Tea Partiers?
Well, I think this idea of working very locally with the local representatives, local senators. Of course, the Tea Party also had Coke money. And they had a clear ideology, which was, down with the government, and so that the Affordable Care Act was bigger government, and they wouldn't want the government to do anything good because then people would want more government. So they were clearly going to protest that, and they did it vigorously. And then they did it, I think, they intimidated people. The members of Congress who came back scared. I don't think the Indivisible is using quite those tactics, but it's working long term.
Well, how's it different?
Italy in 2016.
How's it different from working just as part of the Democratic Party?
They're against what Trump has been doing, but there are Republicans who are upset about Mr. Trump.
Okay, yeah, all right.
And that's part of, say, when you analyze what the constituents are, you don't want to make the other side homogeneous and they're all enemies. You realize that the other side is not that. They're heterogeneous, there are defectors, there are allies there. So the Indivisible, yeah, they may be working on the same side.
Okay, let's put it this way.
Democrats, but they would say they're not a partisan activity. It's
Okay, but compare it, let's say, with the people Bernie Sanders's group, and they have something called Our Revolution, I think. And I live in Canada, so I'm not engaged with a lot of things that I'd like to be. But and then there's the New Green Deal group, which I gather there's sort of a movement around that. So what would be the relationship? Presumably as I read it, the New Green Deal people are much to the left of the regular mainstream Democrats, the Biden people.
Yeah.
And where would Indivisible be on that spectrum?
There's also those oppositions to particular policies are more the focus than on the future policies when we get power, I think. And those are both worthwhile. I think the resistance to what went on at the border in the United States was vital. The resistance that occurred instantly to the banning of immigrants from Muslim countries. It was fantastic. Across the country, people jammed the airports, and they had to back off. They realized, it was a crazy thing to have tried to do. But if there hadn't been all that sudden outburst of resistance, they would have gotten away with it.
Yeah. Well, look, I mean, clearly, for example, what's going on right now with the pandemic is something where we need a movement, and I don't see that it's possible to form one. I mean, there's, the Trump administration has been so totally ineffectual in handling this challenge, this public health challenge, that there's an extreme need for a movement that would really force them to change. And that is not possible because I don't see how you can organize people, when they're all locked down. And at any rate, right now, I think, to me, the very interesting challenge is how we can create a social movement, particularly focusing on the need to develop responses to and ways of preventing pandemics in general, and this pandemic in particular. How to implement public policies that will work quickly. I mean, we're going to have. Last night, the news projected that there will be probably 70,000 more people dead in the U.S. alone by December than would be the case if we would all just do things like wear masks and stay home when we should, and so on. So, we're just not. We need a social movement that's really powerful right now. And it's not happening. What can we do?
Well, I think part of it is be patient, right? So we're in the middle of the crisis. But my guess is when the crisis subsides, the fear that people have experienced because of this will lead to a mobilization. And the fact that, I think in the United States anyways, we had such a faith that we must have a superior public health system that's capable, best in the world. The danger is we're always responding to the last crisis so that we may gear up for a COVID-like thing, and who knows what the next thing will be. It may be the same or it may be different. But I'm relatively hopeful that that people will mobilize after this eases, and that it's touched enough lives that it will have an effect, and that for all the divisiveness of COVID, the one positive thing it has to do, it's offered in terms of constructive conflicts and social movements, is it affects everybody. It's not like the enemy is another person who can identify and mobilize around. It affects you, everyone equally. So
It does,
it's an interesting type of threat to
try to
confront.
explain that to some of these guys who say it's my right as an American citizen to be free to not wear a mask. I mean, that kind of thinking is so childlike, it's so illogical that you would think that it would be apparent to everybody. Viruses do not discriminate between Republicans and Democrats or any gun control enthusiasts or gun owners. They the virus doesn't care, but it treats us all equally. But
I mean, it's also
as if they think it's not the case.
I mean, I think that's true, but it's also interesting that we may be beginning to have a conversation about a substantive issue that has come up because of the virus. And that substantive issue is that this country is divided along the lines of people who have some kind of mythical idea of the United States as a place where individual freedom is the ultimate organizing principle, and a United States where others push back hard against that and believe in community responsibility. That has been the fundamental division in the United States since its founding, and it is at the root of so many of our public policy controversies. So I would say that, yes, it's absurd. I find it absurd that anybody would say I shouldn't wear a mask because it's infringing on my political liberties is absurd. But I see the beginning of a conversation of confronting the fact that this is a fundamental division in our country that we need to have a conversation about.
Okay, God bless us, and let's hope so. But let's speed it up. Is there any way we can think of hurrying the process up? For example, I find it just as ridiculous that there are people who deny climate change, but climate change denial is still so important that it actually has almost a veto power. Trump is in power and he gets to cut down everything the EPA would like to do and withdraw from the Paris Agreement, etc. All these things strike me as utterly irrational and indefensible. And it's hard to even imagine logically what's going on in people's minds that would enable this kind of irrationality to persist year after year after year. But, there is a reckoning coming. The oceans are going to come and get you whether or not you're ready for it. So, the time is, I think Fauci says that the virus will set the timetable. We don't get to choose about when we can open up the country again and so on, because that's all determined by how that virus behaves. And the same is true of climate. But I better stop ranting. And let's talk about the notion of constructive conflicts, because you guys are really good at seeing conflicts as generally a benign thing, as something that's value to society rather than something we should all try to avoid. But the question is how to wage conflicts and how to resolve them and so on. So that seems to be about what you mostly do. Tell us about that.
To me, the exciting thing about this constructive conflicts approach is that I think many people approach conflict as something to fear or avoid and have this unrealistic belief that it's something we need to overcome to create a better world, as if there's some future where we're holding hands and singing and we've overcome all conflict and achieved some kind of state of peaceful euphoria. And to me, the thing about the field of constructive conflicts is it starts from a very different proposition that conflicts are natural, they're unavoidable, and they're essential. They happen from the moment we're born. We're embedded, embroiled in conflicts, and it never ends. So once you see conflict,
that.
right, thank God, because injustice would never be addressed or seen or overcome. The status quo would be forever if it wasn't for conflict.
And we would be bored out of our minds.
That's right.
Imagine what life would be like if we didn't have anything to
That's right.
deal
That's
with.
right. So it's the engine of all sorts of things. And once you start from that perspective, it's not a question of how to avoid it. It's how do we wage conflicts in ways that are relatively constructive and not destructive. And that really is the focus of the book, by looking at case studies where, I mean, conflicts can be waged horribly, doing horrible destruction and damage to relationships and institutions, but sometimes they're waged in ways that do great things, that cause great progress. And so I think Lou's work, and why I was interested in working with him when I first came to graduate school and continue to work with him, really is focused on what can we learn from those stories of constructively waged struggles, so that people feel a little bit like they have more capacity to reach for tools that lead in that path of constructiveness instead of destructiveness, because there's so many tools out there and there's so much richness in the case studies of conflict that over the past 30 years, 40 years, 50 years, scholars have studied. What can we learn from those cases and apply to the things that we're facing now in ways that move us in a good direction?
Beautiful. Inspiring, in fact.
I'd like to make suggested another interpretation of how conflicts are avoided and ignored, and that leads to very bad consequences. The research I've been doing, I looked at how come wages stagnated for workers, and the income of the managers rose spectacularly, and inequality increased hugely. Now there's the interpretation, well, that had to do with automation and global trade and globalization and all these immutable forces. There was a conflict, but that conflict was hidden and covered up and denied. These were immutable forces. Well, a lot of other countries were facing the same immutable forces, but they did not have the huge increase in inequality that occurred in the United States. The fight was waged through ideology, through legislation, and it was not called a conflict. And that was a mistake. And it had dire consequences.
How should it have been waged? With strikes, and what would you call it? If you're saying that it wasn't even treated as a conflict and people acquiesced to it.
Well, I think the Democratic Party might have said that the trade unions need to be protected and aided, that the workers should have a say in how the spoils are divided, and instead, the Democratic Party was relatively quiescent in what was happening, and didn't give a counter position. It was just taken. It just went on quietly, and the ideology of Reagan and other Republican leaders was saying, well, there's these problems out there, and that's nothing we can do about it.
I think
or they got even worse with with the Trumpist kind of approach, which is to say, the problem is this, so we should cut off, we should be tougher on trade, we should be, we should, do the, we should cut taxes somehow. That would be good.
Yeah, Krugman recently had a column or someplace I read where he acknowledged that he had underestimated the seriousness of the trends in the US. And as with many other people who were in favor of globalization, he had assumed that somehow globalization was going to benefit everybody and sooner than it has, or even more than it has, and did not give sufficient weight to the real suffering that was being created and that should have been addressed with some kind of intervention. So I think he's acknowledged, I think that's what you're saying is pretty much the same thing, should have been handled more directly. I myself also am very aware of the fact that when interpersonal conflicts take place and people, change the subject and deny the problem or don't want to talk about it, that goes on for, can last a lifetime and change people's personalities for the worse in general. Yeah. I think by and large, transparency is a good thing. Come out and even have your fight. It's better than pretending. But that's a whole different conversation and not one that you guys involve in. I think you mostly, I believe, when you work is at the level of conflict resolution or conflict management or conflict mediation, rather than as much emphasis on direct action or coercive measures. Am I right?
Well, I think the idea of constructive is that there are ways to fight so that you are more likely to get what you want, and that may involve the other side getting something too. But certainly a nonviolent action is a feature of constructive conflict. That is, when it's well done, when it is thoughtfully and done with good preparation, it is used in a timely fashion. It's great.
That's why I like that term peace pushing, right? Because people will ask the question, well, what does conflict resolution or transformation have to do with activism and change? And sometimes it takes the form of adversarial, coercive movements to shut down city streets or boycott businesses or make commerce impossible. And that's a tool. That's among the many tools that you can use in order to transform a conflict for the ultimate goal of a more peaceful, better, more equitable society. So sometimes, as we said before, kind of thinking of coercion, persuasion, and reward as being the three things you always can play with and mix and match and change strategies. Sometimes coercion is, I would consider, a very constructive strategy under certain circumstances. Sometimes it can be very destructive.
I haven't heard those three enumerated before. That sounds like a little thing that you could take with you. Take away. Yes, how to do absolutely. Conflict resolution work. Persuasion, name the three again. Persuasion, I like that, the persuasion.
Persuasion, reward, and coercion.
And coercion, yeah. Oh, why hadn't I thought of those? That's real cute.
Well, people have been using it. We say there's positive and negative sanctions.
Well, let's think about probably the most interesting current, well, it's not just current, it's gone on forever, but the racial struggle in the US and the current upsurge as Black Lives Matter, and during the pandemic, even the street demonstrations and actions around the death of Floyd. If you suspect that there will be agents provocateurs coming to be as destructive as possible and create a bad impression of the movement, how do you prevent that?
I don't know. I have a colleague in Portland who's an activist and an academic, and I emailed him what's my sorrow and my bewilderment even, and all he ended back saying, I'm trying to get everybody to only demonstrate at the daytime, not at night. The bad people on both sides come out at night.
Huh.
I don't know. Maybe that's a consideration. It does sometimes get intensified at night. And if nobody shows up, nothing happens.
My friend Jill Carr Harris is an organizer in India. She and her husband, Raja Gopal, have organized huge marches across India. And if you've ever seen videos of the Indian demonstrations, they are so disciplined and so orderly. It makes the North American rallies and demonstrations look like a bedlam in comparison. These are people who march along with scarves around their neck and little things to hold on to, and it's very, very well organized. And I asked her the same question: how do you keep away people who want to come and create trouble just to give a bad impression? She said, well, we structure this thing in advance with groups of 10. Everybody belongs to one group of 10, and there's a leader of the 10, and that leader has to know everybody in the group, and they can spot anybody in advance who's coming to try to make trouble, and oust them or arrange in advance to do that. Well, I don't know whether you can do that here, but it might be an idea.
Yeah. And the other thing I think is to think about what you want to achieve, and to be pretty clear of some goals that you're setting. And the Black Lives Matter is a great slogan, obviously, but so what does that mean? What do you want? And by leaving that unclear, it creates a problem in succeeding. The Wall Street occupation was trying to do what? They settled for raising the conversation about inequality. Okay, they probably achieved some of that, but if there were some more specific goals, they might have accomplished more. I think they were afraid that if they said anything specific, they would lose some followers. So
yeah,
and could agree, they could get a lot of agreement that too much inequality. This is terrible.
Yeah.
But by not saying what they wanted to accomplish, it kind of frittered away until they were taken down.
And there's that saying, politics is about naming, framing, and blaming, right? Because certainly conflicts are about things, but they also take place in the form of narratives that we tell about what's going on, who's affected, and why it's happening. And I think the more disciplined organizations, as I think Lou's suggesting, are able to take control of the narrative so that it's clear in people's mind what it's about. And in a vacuum, it's very easy for the Trump administration or others to frame and name the Black Lives Matter protests in a way that is not advantageous to the movement. So more discipline in terms of messaging is also I think really important.
Yeah, yeah. And also, I think a lot of these people were sympathetic to anarchism and did not want to have organization. So they didn't want to create a regular organization. And I can see, I myself prefer networking, where it's all egalitarian and open and everybody has as much time at the microphone as anybody else, and so on. I like that, but if you're really going to look for a specific goal and make it very precise what your objective is, you do need to organize, I think.
Yeah, I think there is this tendency to want to be leaderless and make decisions by consensus. And the other side is always saying, I don't know who to talk to. I want to talk with you. We can make an agreement, but I don't. And there's a disconnect, and that happens too often. I think it is a dilemma. The idea that the people should somehow directly be involved in every stage is probably not always, is often not functional.
Yeah. Okay, I think we have covered a lot of ground here in every direction. And I think we need to wind it up pretty soon. But, it's been fun. And it's got me thinking about things that I hadn't really thought about for a while. And appreciate having that opportunity again. So we will stay in touch. And I thank you very much.
I thank you. I enjoyed the conversation.
Me too. It was my pleasure. Great to be with you.
Okay, good. Thanks. Bye.
Bye-bye.
This conversation is one of the weekly series Talk About Saving the World, produced by Peace Magazine and Project Save the World. Please visit our website at tosavetheworld.ca, where you can sign the Platform for Survival, a list of 25 public policy proposals that, if enacted, would greatly reduce the risk of 6 global threats to humankind. Come back next week for another discussion of a serious global issue.